The scale of the late Cretaceous was not merely a demonstration of biological diversity, but a violent challenge to the laws of Newtonian physics and terrestrial mechanics. While theropods refined the architecture of predation, the Titanosaurian sauropods, specifically titans like Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan, pushed the structural limits of vertebrate physiology to the absolute breaking point. To confront a 70-ton organism that stood missing a second-story window by several meters is to witness the engineering of immensity. This was not simply a large animal. It was a self-sustaining industrial complex of flesh, bone, and pressurized fluid, operating under physical constraints that should have rendered terrestrial life impossible. To understand how an animal could support a mass equivalent to a fleet of modern aircraft, we must look past the column-like limbs and penetrate the thoracic cavity to examine the internal engine, the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. We begin with the fundamental problem of hydrostatic pressure. To pump blood from the thoracic core up a 12-meter neck to supply oxygen to the brain, the sauropod heart required a mechanical output that has no modern parallel. Calculations suggest that a titanosaur heart must have weighed over 400 kilograms, operating with a left ventricle wall of immense thickness to generate a systolic blood pressure exceeding 300 millimeters of mercury. This extreme pressure was a biological necessity to overcome gravity, yet it created a secondary crisis: how to prevent the blood vessels in the lower limbs from bursting under the sheer weight of the returning fluid column. The solution was an intricate system of high-pressure arterial walls, specialized venous valves, and a thick, tight sheath of dermal tissue that acted exactly like a modern G-suit worn by fighter pilots. This compression architecture localized the pressure, ensuring that the vascular system remained intact even when the animal shifted its massive weight. The neck itself was not a heavy mass of muscle and solid bone, but a masterpiece of structural optimization. The cervical vertebrae were highly pneumatic, riddled with internal air spaces and supported by a web of thin bone struts that reduced the weight of the spine by up to 60%. This weight reduction was the key to their gigantism. It allowed for an immense reach without creating a front-heavy leverage problem that would tip the animal forward. If you are captivated by this forensic and mechanical breakdown of the ancient world's largest biological machines, ensure you are subscribed to the channel and have liked this video. Your engagement is the blueprint upon which we build these high-fidelity prehistoric archives. The respiratory system of these titans was the true enabler of their scale, operating on an avian-style, unidirectional airflow mechanism. Rather than the tidal, inefficient lungs of mammals, sauropods possessed a continuous flow loop system connected to an extensive network of air sacs that extended into the vertebrae, ribs, and limbs. When a titanosaur inhaled, oxygenated air did not just enter the lungs, it filled the posterior air sacs. Upon exhalation, this fresh air was pushed forward through the lung tissue, ensuring that the respiratory surface was exposed to constant oxygen extraction during both phases of the breath. This hyper-efficient system allowed them to meet the massive metabolic demands of their enormous bodies, while simultaneously acting as an internal cooling system. A 70-ton endothermic body produces an immense amount of metabolic heat. Without this internal air conditioning network, which dissipated heat directly from the core through respiration, these animals would have literally cooked themselves from the inside out. The digestive furnace of the sauropod was another component of this engineering marvel. They did not chew their food. They lacked the cranial machinery for mastication. Instead, their pencil-like teeth were designed solely for stripping foliage, which was swallowed whole into a massive, fermenting gastric vat. This structural decision shifted the weight of digestion from the head to the body's center of gravity, allowing the neck to remain light and highly mobile. The head was merely a retrieval mechanism, a low-mass sensor array perched at the end of a long crane, while the massive torso acted as the processing plant. The movement of this organism was a slow, calculated distribution of kinetic force. The feet were equipped with massive, cushion-like pads of fibroelastic tissue that distributed the crushing weight across a wider surface area, protecting the joints from high-impact shock waves. Every step was an expenditure of energy that had to be balanced by an astronomical intake of nutrients, turning these animals into nomadic vacuum cleaners that reshaped the forests and river deltas they inhabited. They were the architects of their ecosystems, clearing entire swaths of canopy and cycling tons of nutrients back into the soil daily. To look at a titanosaur is to look at the absolute ceiling of terrestrial evolution. Any larger, and the bones themselves would require a density that biology cannot produce without sacrificing mobility. Any heavier, and the cardiac pressures would cause systemic failure. The engineering of Immensity was a fragile balance, a high-stakes calculation where every millimeter of bone thickness and every beat of the 400-kilogram heart was measured against the unyielding physics of the planet. As we move deeper into the specific mechanics of their growth rates, how an egg the size of a football transformed into a 70-ton titan in less than 3 decades, we see a process of cellular acceleration that remains one of the greatest mysteries of paleobiology. This was a lineage that conquered the world through scale, turning size into the ultimate armor and defining the Mesozoic era as an age of true biological giants. The cellular acceleration required to build a 70-ton titanosaur is one of the most radical departures from modern mammalian growth strategies. A newborn Argentinosaurus emerged from an egg no larger than a football, weighing less than 5 kilograms. To reach its terminal adult mass, the animal had to increase its weight by a factor of 14,000. Bone histology reveals that this was achieved through a process of continuous, uninterrupted growth fueled by a hyperactive juvenile metabolism. For the first 20 years of its life, a sauropod was a biological rocket, depositing layers of highly vascularized fibrolamellar bone at a rate that has no equivalent in modern reptiles. This growth was an evolutionary race against time. In the Cretaceous ecosystem, to remain small was to remain prey. Only by achieving a scale that bypassed the physical capabilities of apex theropods like Giganotosaurus could a sauropod secure absolute ecological immunity. But this massive scale created a secondary engineering crisis, the kinetics of locomotion. An adult titanosaur could not run, trot, or hop. The structural limits of bone and cartilage strictly prohibited any movement that allowed all 4 limbs to leave the ground simultaneously. Their locomotion was a permanent walk, a synchronized distribution of mass where at least 3 limbs were in constant contact with the earth. The limbs themselves were perfectly vertical columns, positioned directly beneath the body to channel the crushing gravitational force straight down into the skeletal pillars. This structural alignment minimized the shear stress on the joints, converting the skeleton from a flexible frame into a series of biological compression towers. The cartilage caps on the ends of their long bones were immensely thick, acting as hydraulic shock absorbers that prevented bone-on-bone friction from destroying the joints under the weight of a 70-ton load. If you are finding this deep investigation into the mechanical limits of prehistoric life compelling, ensure you are subscribed to the channel and have liked this video. Your support is what allows us to continue mapping these lost giants with total scientific accuracy. The interaction between this giant and its predators was not a high-speed duel, but a slow, industrial war of attrition. A Maposaurus or Giganotosaurus pack did not attempt to wrestle a 70-ton Argentinosaurus to the ground. Instead, they engaged in flesh grazing using their blade-like teeth to strip sections of meat from the sauropod's flanks, intending to cause death through systemic shock and blood loss over several days. In response, the sauropod's primary defense was its sheer mass and the kinetic energy of its tail. The tail of a titanosaur was an extension of the caudal vertebrae, controlled by massive caudifemoralis muscles. A single lateral sweep of this multi-ton whip could deliver a strike with enough kinetic force to fracture the skull of any theropod instantly. Furthermore, the skin of many titanosaurs was reinforced with osteoderm's bony armor plates embedded directly into the dermal layer. This turned the animal's flank into a reinforced wall of flesh and bone, protecting the vital thoracic cavity and the high-pressure cardiovascular system from deep arterial lacerations. The internal energetics of surviving such an attack were immense. Repairing a 3-meter wound required a massive diversion of metabolic resources, forcing the 400-kilogram heart to pump specialized healing factors and clotting agents through miles of vascular highways. This is the reality of gigantism. It is a lifestyle of constant, heavy-duty maintenance, where even a minor biological failure can trigger a cascading systemic collapse. The sauropod was a prisoner of its own dimensions, a creature that had traded agility and speed for the absolute security of scale, living out its life as a slow, deliberate monument to the limits of terrestrial flesh. As the seasons shifted and the great inland forests experienced periods of drought, these giants were forced into massive, continental migrations, driven by the permanent necessity to feed the unstoppable furnace of their digestive vats. The finality of the sauropod legacy is a profound testament to the limits of structural engineering on a planet governed by gravity. For over 100 million years, the titanosaurs did not merely survive. They dictated the ecological terms of the Mesozoic era, proving that the constraints of mass and blood pressure could be conquered through radical anatomical innovation. The Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan were the absolute zenith of this lineage, living monuments that transformed 70 tons of organic matter into a perfectly balanced, self-regulating compression structure. However, the very stability that allowed these giants to flourish became their terminal vulnerability when the KPG extinction event shattered the global climate. An organism that functions as a high-volume industrial processing plant for foliage requires a continuous, uninterrupted supply of canopy and forest ecosystems. When the atmospheric blackout halted photosynthesis, the massive vegetative vacuum cleaners of the Cretaceous ran out of fuel within weeks. For a 70-ton titanosaur, starvation was not a slow process, but a rapid, systemic shutdown. The 400-kilogram heart, requiring massive amounts of metabolic energy just to sustain a resting blood pressure, could no longer maintain the hydrostatic force needed to push fluid up the 12-meter neck. The respiratory loop of air sacs, designed for high-efficiency oxygen extraction, became useless in an atmosphere choking on ash and toxic gases. The collapse of the sauropods was the closing of the grandest chapter in vertebrate history. When they vanished, the secret of terrestrial immensity was lost with them. In the 66 million years that have followed, no land animal has ever approached even half their mass. The mammals that inherited the Earth would refine the mechanics of speed, agility, and cognitive calculation, but they would remain forever humbled by the structural limits of the skeleton, never achieving the architectural grandeur of the Mesozoic titans. Today, when we excavate a single femur that measures over 2 meters in length, we are not looking at a primitive relic. We are looking at a biological pillar that successfully defied gravity, a piece of heavy-duty engineering that supported a weight equivalent to a modern space rocket launcher. If this forensic and mechanical breakdown of the ancient world's largest biological machines has shifted your perspective on the boundaries of life, ensure you are subscribed to the channel and have liked this video. Your engagement is the foundation upon which we resurrect these lost empires with total scientific precision. The story of the sauropod is a reminder that biology is an unyielding calculation of physics, chemistry, and environmental opportunity. They were the ultimate expression of scale, creatures that turned size into an impregnable fortress and walked the Earth not as mere inhabitants, but as tectonic forces that reshaped the landscape with every step. As we close this archive in the Valley of Titans, we leave the great titanosaurs in the deep strait of the fossil record, where their bones remain as silent, stone witnesses to an age when the Earth was large enough, warm enough, and bold enough to support the weight of giants. The reign of the long necks is over, but the engineering of immensity remains the greatest physical triumph that terrestrial life has ever achieved.